This year, Canada announced in the federal budget that they were going to change the way that they managed exemptions on our capital gains. Now, this came across as a small change and they tried to brush it under the rug, and yet many financial analysts are shocked at the implications, with well over 1 million people likely to be affected by this in their lifetime, and a potential change in our GDP by up to $90 billion, according to the hub.ca. So what are these changes? Are they things that might affect you? And how are they being rolled out across individuals and corporations in Canada? I'm Sean Provencher. I'm a real estate agent in Victoria, BC, and I put together YouTube content to try to help people understand how to navigate our market. If you're considering an investment, a purchase, or a sale in real estate, and you're curious about how this or anything else in our market might affect you, I'd love to connect. You can use a link in the description to grab some time with me. But for now, let's get into the video. All right, well, if we're gonna do this, the first thing that we have to sort out is what's a capital gain and how are we typically going to be taxed on these in Canada? Well, a capital gain is essentially the increase in value of an asset that you purchased. So let's say that you purchased a home for $100,000 a few years ago, and today you were able to sell it for $200,000 and you didn't spend any money to do that. Well, the capital gain would be the increase in value of that property. In the example I just shared, that would be $100,000. Well, the way that Canada has taxed these is by using something they call an inclusion rate. And the inclusion rate essentially says we're going to take a portion of that gain and we're going to add it to your personal income. So in the example that I just used, there was a $100,000 capital gain. And in Canada, up until this year, the capital gains inclusion rate has been 50%, which means they would have taken half of that $100,000 and added it to your personal income, and you would have been taxed just like on any other personal income. Now, what's changed? Well, what they've done is they've changed the inclusion rate across the board for corporations. They've taken it from half, 50%, to two-thirds, 66.66666. So for corporations, it's just cut and dry. It's that simple. For an individual, they wanted to make it a little more complicated. So what they've done is they've said that the first $250,000 on a capital gain would be included at the same rate as before. So the inclusion rate remains 50% on the first $250,000. Now, beyond that, it increases to two-thirds, or 66.6%, just like it does for a corporation. And that's essentially all they've done. What does this actually mean for most Canadians? Well, if you go to the Department of Finance's website and read their page, they've thankfully provided us with what they call a backgrounder. And I think this is a great place to start because it really highlights how this is stuff that might not be the most accessible to most Canadians. I'll read you a quote. Today, the government is reaffirming its intention to make the tax system fairer by tabling a notice of ways and means motion to introduce legislation to implement the measure as proposed in Budget 2024. What? And you see, this is kind of the problem for most Canadians. It's calculations on top of calculations, and it's verbiage like that, which I don't know anyone who can make sense of. So let's talk about what this actually means to most Canadians. Well, first of all, to many Canadians who live in their primary residence and they don't have another home or an investment or a cottage, it's not really going to change very much at all. In fact, it should theoretically change nothing. Well, what about investors? We talk a lot about investors, and often when they announce things like this, they tend to demonize real estate investors as people who are large corporations taking affordable houses away from Canadians. And really, I'm going to just level with you. Our housing problem in Canada is not borne by investors, at least not now. We've had some strife in the past with international money coming in, and you know, we have a lot of people who are watching very carefully for larger corporations to buy up huge swaths of Canadian property, but that hasn't really actually been what's happened. The majority of investors in Canada are your neighbors. They're people a few doors over. It's someone buying a condo before it's built to try to help pay for their kids to go through school, and this is going to affect them in a big way. When we look at the hub.ca, they did an article on this, and they estimated that 1.26 million Canadians would be affected by this in their lifetime. And they said that this could affect our GDP by up to $90 billion. So this is not a small change. And the investors that this is designed to counter are our neighbors who are just trying to create a better life for themselves and their children. So, on one hand, it doesn't really affect a lot of people at all because they're not people who are holding real estate investments. But on another hand, this is just a bit of a cash grab against Canadians who are trying really hard in an economy that isn't great. So it's sad to see that this is the kind of direction that we're going in an already strained market that, frankly, a lot of people don't know how to navigate. And then finally, I think that this is something that creates a bit of a gap in confidence for Canadians who maybe have been carrying real estate investments for years or even decades with plans to sell it down the road because there's no way to opt out of this. This is something that you might have been paying into an investment for years and years. It might be decades that you've been carrying an investment in anticipation of this being something that would better your life in the future. What are some of the common questions people are going to have right now? Well, the first one is going to be, what about my primary residence? What about my home, the place that I live with my family? Is this something that now I'm going to be paying a capital gain on? And the answer is still no. Now, for Canadians, our principal primary residence is something that is capital gains exempt completely. You will not pay capital gains on your principal residence unless there's some funny business. So if you left and rented it out for a number of years, or if you were running a business from your home, make sure that you speak to your accountant. In fact, I think that's probably the first FAQ I should have mentioned. Should you speak to your accountant? Well, the answer is always yes, because I'm not an accountant and I'm not here to give tax advice. So if you're curious about how this applies to your situation, don't reach out to me, reach out to your accountant. I'm here to give real estate advice. Now, there are a number of other questions. So, assuming that you're living in your principal residence and you're not doing anything funky, you should be exempt. The second question a lot of people have is, well, what if I own this property with a partner? I bought it with my friend, my brother, my mother. Well, in that instance, the good news is that each individual who is part of the ownership group is eligible to have that first $250,000 be at the 50% inclusion rate. So, maybe this won't really affect you as much because you can spread that out quite a bit. Okay, now the third question is where it starts to get really complicated. What about capital losses? I have a capital loss from a previous year. How does that affect this? And generally, the idea is that this should be net of capital losses. So you can downplay your capital gain by offsetting it with a loss from a previous year. And that can be great. However, it gets really complicated really quickly. So if you have capital losses, again, the answer is speak to your accountant. All right, well, now that we've got the background out of the way and some FAQs, well, what does this really mean to an average Canadian and how's it going to affect you? I think the biggest question that people have is, what about my primary residence? And don't worry, if you've lived in your home, you've never left and rented it out to someone, and you don't run a business from your house, you basically don't have to worry about this. It's not going to change anything for you. Who this really affects is property investors. And when they make announcements like these, they tend to paint property investors as these evil corporations buying up swaths of our land and making our houses unaffordable. But I can tell you, as someone who's boots to the ground, that's really not who these people are. The majority of property investors are your neighbors. They're people in your community. They're people who saved a little bit of money up and they're putting it aside in something that they thought was relatively safe as a way to save for their retirement or to put their kids through college or something like that. These are not evil corporations that are trying to hurt us. These are people who live next door. And the problem is that they might have been paying into these properties for years, decades. And now, after putting in all that work and all that investment, they're seeing the rules change on how they can access that money that they've worked their entire lives for. And to me, that's really hard to watch happen. But what I think hurts us even more in the long run is the changing confidence that people have placing their money in Canadian investments, knowing that the rules are up for grabs when people feel like they could take a little bit more and use it somewhere in their federal budget. So to me, I'm really concerned with the confidence that people will have putting money back into our economy when we see these kinds of changes taking place. I'd love to hear from you. How do you think this will affect you? And what do you think of these changes? Is this something that's positive? Did it need to happen? Or is it just a cash grab? As always, I'm so grateful that people take the time to watch these videos. So if you got some value, please like and subscribe because we have lots more coming up from you. And if there's something that you're curious about in your particular situation, reach out to me. You can use the link in the description to grab a time with me. I'd love to have a conversation, and I'm grateful for the time that you spent with me today. Thanks for watching.